The full-length album has always been my favourite format for listening to and remembering music. I think that it really nicely encapsulates a particular period of an artist's career or journey, and I like how things like the running order and having an opener and a closing track are really important to the overall experience, as well as the artwork and the packaging matching the tone and feel of the music. The 10 albums that I've chosen for this video are ones that I've consistently returned to over the years, continuing to find new things in them and gain new experiences, despite closely listening to them countless times. There are dozens of other albums out there that I could have easily swapped out and changed around in terms of my enjoyment of them. However, I've chosen these 10 as they have influenced me a great deal, harkening idyllic musical landscapes and inspiring me to try to get to similarly beautiful places in my own work. Aphex Twin, Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92. Aphex Twin, or Richard D. James, is without a doubt the most fascinating and mysterious figure in the world of electronic music. Part of his persona is that he's been known to lie, and you never really know what's true about him and what isn't. But that is partly what keeps people endlessly fascinated and curious about him. And of course the fact that his music is immensely comforting and unique. Richard's debut album is a masterpiece of unearthly soundscapes and surreal moods. Allegedly, some of the album's material dates all the way back to 1985, when Richard was only about 14, and it's a known fact that he used a ZX Spectrum to record and sequence the music, as well as various early samplers from the late 80s. He's also a genius with electronics, and would often modify synthesizers and drum machines. A bizarre and interesting fact is that apparently some of the album's audio quality suffers due to it being recorded onto a cassette tape damaged by a cat. Much of the music on this album appears to me to reflect feelings of isolation and introspection, but at the same time it's built on the fundamentals of genres like acid house and techno, which are of course really extroverted and enjoyed by big groups of people. There's something very singular and solitary to me about the music of Aphex Twin, but not in the sense of being lonely and unhappy, but much more a feeling of being content with your own company and space, and that kind of freedom that you can feel if you're particularly introverted. It's very much headphones music, and it's a very similar feeling that I get from a lot of classical music. When I first checked it out, I didn't appreciate this album much at all. As is often the case with very densely layered music, you have to persevere with it before the individual nuances and melodies really get through to you and emerge from the dense fog of sound. The opening track, X-Tool, is sort of like new age video game music. It's like being at a fairground in the pouring rain just as it's getting dark. Many of its sampled and percussive elements evoke images of heavy raindrops hitting illuminated fairground rides. But at the same time, there's such an immense feeling of warmth and happiness. There's a very interesting video on YouTube of someone dissecting the song, and we find out that many of Extal's parts are actually all sampled from the same piece of music, which is a track by another artist called Evil at Play. Track 9, Scott Key 7th Path, is without a doubt one of the creepiest pieces of music that he's put out there. It was really effectively used in the 2005 documentary Ghosts on the Underground. Whenever this song comes on and I hear those unsettling synth blobs, I'm always instantly transported into some creepy, ominous, windy tunnel, expecting to meet some dude in old-fashioned clothes, wielding a gas lamp. Whilst I do think this album sounds really rich and detailed on vinyl, I do think it's best enjoyed when you're out and about, exploring on your own, all whilst enjoying a late-night bus journey, coupled with views of urban cityscapes. The vast array of soundscapes on the album take you to such unearthly places. It's like you're exploring an abandoned tube station on another planet, or looking up at the glass panels of some kind of fictional space station. I think the album can work superbly in the foreground or just blending into the background. Ever since I first got into this record, it's been a staple of my listening rotation. I think once you appreciate it, it really stays with you in the long run. And it really is one of the finest electronic records ever put out. And of course, Aphex Twin's influence on the landscape of electronic music is immense, going on to influence some of the most celebrated names in the genre. Also, if you find yourself getting lost in this album, there's a vast array of tracks that he made around this time that very much match the aesthetic and atmosphere of Selected Ambient Works, to be found on YouTube. You can spend hours digging through obscure tracks that he never officially released, The Zombies, Odessey and Oracle. I think for this spot I could have easily chosen Forever Changes or Pet Sounds, two other late 60s masterpieces that I've taken a great deal of inspiration from. But I think I chose Odessey and Oracle because the feeling it gives me is so strong and unique, and is really unmatched by any other album out there. I actually only listen to this album about once a year because it's such a unique sort of feeling. I don't want to wear it out too much. I think that it's not only the sublime songwriting on display that really sells the album, but also the creative use of vocal harmonies and group vocals. You have this fantastic blend of the Beatles and the Beach Boys, but at the same time they really have their own sound that was like nothing else at the time. I think this album is best enjoyed on a drive in the country in overcast weather, and it seems to have such a strong autumnal feel about it. This album has a lot of mellotron on it as a result of the Beatles leaving one behind in the studio, and I'm always curious to explore the mellotron textures that are featured on the album. You have this fantastic sampled church organ sound that was used on Butcher's Tale, and I've used that a few times in my own music just as a reference to Odessey and Oracle. By the time this album had come out, the group had actually broken up, and the record as a whole didn't receive a great deal of attention at the time. However, over the decades it's subsequently become widely recognised as one of the finest albums of its kind and a true masterpiece. Paul Weller of The Jam actually loves the album so much that he still buys it for people. The album cover is this flower power collage. It kind of reminds me of Mika's Life in Cartoon Motion album cover. Odessey was accidentally misspelled, but they didn't have time to fix the error, but that's just one of the unique things that adds to the charm of the album. I actually deliberately bought the American pressing of the album because I really like having this text at the top, which isn't present on UK pressings of the album. Somehow I just think it matches it really nicely. This is a very special album and one of the best ever made. Number 3, Moby, Play. Moby is a multi-instrumentalist, producer and songwriter. He rose to popularity in about 1991 with his techno hit Go, and he had on and off success throughout the 90s with various different projects. However, it wasn't until after the release of Play in 1999 that he became majorly successful, and this record went on to sell about 12 million copies. I think that a big contributor in the album's success is the fact that all of the album's tracks were heavily licensed to be used in adverts, TV shows and film. Around the turn of the century, this album was huge and more or less inescapable. The album has become well known for its heavy use of sampling, creatively implementing old blues and gospel vocals into dance and hip-hop inspired tracks. For me, Play is as well balanced as an album can possibly be. Its melodic content is warm and densely emotional, partly due to the vocal samples having such a rich, soulful quality to them in the first place. This, with incredibly slick and cutting-edge production, makes it a well-remembered 90s classic. Play was really like nothing else in the landscape of music in 1999, and to this day it really is quite a bizarre and eclectic piece of work, especially considering its widespread commercial appeal. I think it's worth noting that Play is like nothing else in Moby's catalogue. Moby has this very synthetic, rainy sound, but this album sounds nothing like anything else that he's done. The most well-known tune on the record, Porcelain, is a gorgeous, melancholic summer skipper. Moby was inspired to sing on the track after rediscovering New Order, and being influenced by the fact that Bernard Sumner isn't a technically amazing singer, but his voice still perfectly matches the tone and feel of the band's music. Moby became confident enough to use his voice on the tracks that suited it. The way that Play is sequenced has always fascinated me. You have the really extroverted first side, which comes to a climax with the burst of energy that is the track Machete. This then transports you through a doorway into the second, more dark and ethereal side of the album, and we're treated to a series of melancholic and atmospheric compositions, ranging from trip-hop to classical. This then comes to an emotional climax with the track My Weakness, which is one of the most breathtakingly beautiful, yet uncomfortable pieces of music that I've ever heard. This album in some ways reminds me of DJ Shadow's Endtroducing, both albums having a really warm, vintage cinematic sound. This might be due to the album being recorded on quite lo-fi equipment, even for 1998 when it was recorded. Moby heavily utilised rack-mounted Akai samplers, as well as the Oberheim Matrix 1000 synthesizer. There are so many micro samples weaved into the fabric of this record. These are often used as small musical hooks or textures. Sometimes I attempt to identify the original sample material. I'm endlessly fascinated with pulling it apart in that way. Moby made the album in his tiny bedroom studio in New York. He attempted to take it into some professional studios for mixing. They tried to run one of the tracks through like a modern processing unit as it had a lot of hiss and noise on it. However, in doing so, it kind of took away a lot of the endearing and organic qualities that the music had, from essentially being like a home recorded demo. Often, recording music when the idea is as fresh as it'll ever be will result in the most interesting and emotional recording that you'll ever get, even if it's done in a very amateurish fashion. 4 of the songs on the album are actual 4-track cassette demos. I think that Moby had tried to re-record them on his main equipment, but simply couldn't recreate the atmosphere or the feeling of them, which is quite interesting as those same recordings were used in movies and ended up in millions of people's CD collections. Play has to be my most listened to album of all time. I've probably listened to it more times in my life than any other piece of recorded music, and it still fascinates me. The album cover and packaging for me is so classic and iconic, and I've always thought of it as being like a staple of every record shop wall around the turn of the century. Someone I know recently redid the album cover really well. Play was one of the first ever albums that I was exposed to from a very young age, and it's really stuck with me over the years. I think that there's something about the variety of musical styles and the production that just appeals to me so much. You have elements of trip hop, electronica, breakbeat, ambient, classical, rock, and blues all in one album. Air, Moon Safari. Legendary French duo Air's debut album is a masterpiece of sedative, emotive, and dreamy sound worlds. With the exception of the string arrangements that were done at Abbey Road, the whole album was done at home on a digital 8-track recorder, which is very limiting, but it forces you to get the most out of the few tracks that you have. And I have no doubt that that limitation majorly affected the way they thought about the arrangement and the composition of the tracks. An interesting part of the group's identity is that they have quite a tongue-in-cheek sense of humour and don't necessarily take themselves too seriously, with track titles like Sexy Boy. It's interesting as they maintain this quality at the same time as tugging at your heartstrings with some of the most beautiful music you've ever heard. Many of the songs are based around short vocoder phrases that repeat, and you never really get bored of them because the instrumentals are so enchanting and ever-changing. The bass line on the opener track is extremely hooky, yet tranquil and cool. It's like you're checking into the most peaceful, luxurious hotel on earth, and it's quite simply the best lounge music ever made. The combination of quirky analog instruments with lush string arrangements makes for some very strong Brian Wilson Pet Sounds vibes. The piano arpeggios on Kelly Watch the Stars are magical, coupled with the theremin and Korg synth pads. These expansive sounds are nicely contrasted by a cheap-sounding Casio drum machine loop and a glockenspiel, giving it a very unadulterated feel. Moon Safari has some of the most creative and colourful synth layering I've ever heard on a record, and they really make great use of things like filters and noise for transition effects. Another album by Air to check out is their third album, Talkie Walkie, one of the most comforting and warm albums I've ever heard. I think that Moon Safari is a very summery album, particularly the songs with Beth Hirsch, whose soft and melty tone perfectly complements the gentle and sombre instrumentals. It's like the feeling where it's warm but there's a cool breeze and you can hear the wind chimes and smell the freshly cut grass. I can't talk about this album without mentioning the Kelly Watch the Stars 12-inch single. I remember my mum having this in addition to the album when I was little and enjoying it just as much as the main album. And of course I had to get it on vinyl. It contains more of a danceable, upbeat version of the song, which features out-of-this-world vocal layering and some brilliant harmonic noise effects. The EP also has an orchestral version of the track Remember, which is very reminiscent of some of Electric Light Orchestra's greatest moments. Blur, 13. 13 is the only album on this list that I don't own on vinyl. I do, however, have this cassette. It's quite saturated and blurry sounding, but I think that matches the aesthetic and the identity of the album quite nicely. This album was a huge change of pace for British band Blur. even more so than their gritty 1997 self-titled record. 13 is much more dark and twisted than any of the band's previous output. The songs that lead singer and songwriter Damon Albarn wrote for the album came from a much more personal place than anything that had come before. To assist with the band's growing experimentation, they enrolled producer William Orbit onto the project. A highly innovative techno and ambient producer who at the time was fresh off of producing Madonna's groundbreaking Ray of Light record. 13 was born out of Damon Albarn's personal recording studio of the same name, which was a small workspace on an industrial complex. The same studio was later used to construct much of the material for the first two Gorillaz albums. The engineers at the studio, Jason Cox and Tom Gerling, had a very spontaneous approach to recording and engineering. The studio consisted of highly unconventional equipment, including a homemade theremin, children's speech toys, a pair of plastic horns hung from the ceiling used for drum recording, and a battered old Hammond organ, among many other things. Essentially, the space served as an easy writing and recording facility for all of Damon's projects, and was built from the ground up for this purpose. When the band entered Studio 13 in the summer of 1998, they fleshed out the songs by means of jamming and improvising, often recording extensive jams and ideas onto DAT tape recorders. There was no real order or method to the recording process. These sessions were later put into Pro Tools and reconstructed from the ground up, using all of the recorded material from the sessions. The album was pieced together very slowly, largely by William Orbit and guitarist Graham Coxon, who is responsible for many of the abstract and explosive sounds heard on the album. Orbit was described as being very childlike in the studio, often encouraging the band to create all kinds of bizarre soundscapes and really embracing anything and everything that went down at the studio. And this way of working was very different from their previous producer Stephen Street, who worked in a far more structured fashion. The track 1992 is a very spooky, melancholic song. It features wobbly guitar improvisations from Coxon, and a roaring, whimsical sonic mass that gradually obscures the entire landscape of the track. This huge sound was created from Coxon playing the guitar, and Orbit feeding the signal back on itself endlessly, riding the recording console as if it were a giant spaceship, until it sounded somewhere between a sonically enhanced tube train and an alien spaceship landing. Track 7, Battle, contains a reoccurring sample of Love Song by Simple Minds, which serves as an ambient electronic texture. This is accompanied by an ominous yet lonely sounding piano line from Damon. This was captured by the engineers holding microphones and walking round Damon while he was playing his piano, making a weird phasing effect. This album is very close to my heart. It's peculiar and bizarre, yet warm and immensely beautiful, and by far one of my biggest influences. I've always thought that this album begins to cross into Gorillaz territory, with the style and direction that Damon's songwriting was going in at the time. I think the song Trailer Park could have easily been an early Gorillaz track, as well as Bugman, which features Damon singing in quite a cartoony fashion that's very reminiscent of some of his vocals on the first Gorillaz album. Around the time of this album's production, Damon was also contributing to the score of the movie Ravenous, and this may be the reason for all the eerie instrumental passages hidden in between the main songs. Sadly, people don't recognise 13 very much in Blur's catalogue, and look more towards the self-titled record and Part Life, but for me personally, it's their finest. Caramel is not only my favourite thing released by the band, but one of my favourite productions of all time. It has a very cathartic and intimate vocal performance from Damon, accompanied by a surreal yet emotional musical landscape, comprised of fleeting ambient guitar layers, Hammond organ, and abstract guitar expressions. The lyrics evoke images of blizzards and faraway mountains. The piece develops in such an unusual way, becoming almost silent before we're hit by a roaring guitar screech, and then immediately thrown into the emotional climax of the song, with Damon's echoing falsetto, as well as a guitar solo that resembles the sound of a steam train, before the song returns to its original tranquil state. I could talk about this record all day, and if I had to pick one record, this would be my favourite album. Tame Impala, Currents. For me, Currents is one of the ultimate high-fidelity pop albums, and it really hits you in the face the first time you hear it. You have fantastic elements of psychedelic pop, but at the same time there's a strong flavour of disco and R&B. On the surface, the music of Tame Impala appears to celebrate the psychedelic rock and pop of the 1960s and 70s, but with a modern twist. But really, at its core, the project is a hugely personal expression for Kevin Parker, who more or less writes and records all of the material by himself. I could have easily picked any of the first three Tame Impala records in terms of how important they've been for me as a musician. However, Currents just barely tops Lonerism for my favourite. In the early years of the project, Kevin Parker was quite shy and quiet about Tame Impala really being a solo project, and it was largely promoted and received as a group effort, even down to his deeply personal and introspective lyrics being quite buried in the mix on the first two albums. Many fans and critics kind of misunderstood the project as effectively being some guys jamming and hitting record, and I think that Kevin was really frustrated by this, as that really isn't the true nature of it. Currents is the first album where he really has the confidence to own what it is he's doing, and all of the promotional material for the album featured images and videos of Kevin alone in his house, recording all of the instruments and producing the album by himself. Currents is where we first get to hear that really marvellous, boomy, punchy drum sound that Kevin has become known for, which I like to call Kevin Goes to the Disco. It features prevalently on the 2017 Pond album, The Weather, which was of course produced by Kevin. Whilst the first two Tame Impala albums' lyrical content dealt with very strong feelings of social isolation and self-doubt, Currents deals much more with the idea of moving forward and maturing as a person, even if you have to make difficult decisions in order to accommodate that. This theme, I think, is particularly apparent on songs like Eventually and Yes I'm Changing. I think with this album he just embraced what he loved and wasn't necessarily ashamed to do something a lot more basic or pop-inspired. The album takes a far more minimalist approach in its production than previous album Lonerism, which had instruments and sounds coming from all directions. For Currents, he only gave the songs as much layering as what was necessary, and I think as a result you have a slightly more digestible and easily accessible record. There was a great deal of excitement getting into this album for the first time. I'd never really heard that sort of sugary psychedelic sound done so perfectly, and I haven't ever since. Kevin really is a master of what it is that he does, and is multi-talented in the true sense. From being a master of drum recording, vocal layering, lyrics, and production, he creates delicate but powerful anthems, using just the right amount of the right ingredients, and executes it perfectly in the process. As is the case with most Tame Impala material, Currents makes you feel like you're on a warm beach in a sedated state, letting the blissful waves of melodic gold wash over you. This kind of idyllic imagery even stretches to Kevin Parker's recording environment. We see an Instagram video of Kevin recording the album in an idyllic wooden beach mansion with 180-degree views of the Indian Ocean, bathed in sunlight, all whilst mind-blowing psychedelic vocal layering blasts out of Kevin's giant 70s hi-fi speakers. The Prodigy, music for the Jilted generation. Considering how commercially successful they were early on, the Prodigy were quite an unusual group in the early 90s, in the sense that there was only one core musician, Liam Howlett, who wrote and produced everything, the other three band members originally just being on-stage dancers. I was first introduced to this album when I found a dusty CD copy in a charity shop bin when I was about 7, and I've been absolutely mesmerised by it ever since. Musically and stylistically, this album was a huge leap from the group's debut album Experience, which brought rave music into the mainstream with singles like Charlie and Outer Space. Whilst they did very much establish their own musical and visual identity on the first album, this is the album where they go in a far darker, more punky direction, which is the image that they're most strongly associated with. Liam began work on Jilted after becoming fed up with the rave scene and wanting to inject new styles into the group's music. He went back into the studio with a new approach after hearing Rage Against the Machine for the first time while on tour in America. I would describe much of the album as having a very gothic, metallic and leathery sound, all while still being dance music. There's something really sci-fi and horror themed about it, I feel, but on the other hand you have really meditative moments like the track 3 Kilos. Jilted really is like nothing else out there. I love all the gongs and deranged laughter samples that are kind of peppered throughout the tracks. The whole thing gives off a really kind of menacing kind of feel. A big part of the Prodigy's identity is that it kind of has the energy of a rock band, all whilst being electronically produced. And this was even more prominent on the group's follow-up, The Fat of the Land. Unlike most dance producers of the time, who would more or less just sample breakbeats and vocals, Liam would often sample distorted guitar lines, funk loops, movie dialogue, and sound effects. As is the case with Moby Play, I think there's a really great marriage on this album of sampled sounds and original melodic compositions, which have great artistic merit in their own right. Neil McLellan, who co-produced and mixed the album, says that Liam is actually the best programmer that he's ever met in terms of taking completely unrelated sounds and making them work so perfectly together, going on to say that he's not come across anyone else that has that kind of musical sensibility when it comes to working with samples. The album was born out of Liam's tiny bedroom studio, dubbed Earthbound Studios. The facility was mainly based around a Roland W30 keyboard, which had sampling and sequencing capabilities, and this would be extremely limiting by today's standards. So it is quite amazing what Liam was able to achieve with it. The sessions were later moved to the Strong Room Studios in London, where they effectively enhanced the sound of it. They ran the tracks through the recording console to compress and fatten them up. They also took advantage of the studio live room ambience and would play individual layers through a giant speaker out into the room and then record it with a microphone. And this would give the music more of a sort of live band sort of feel. They even used a grand piano as a resonator for some of the synth sounds. Originally, the album contained a beautiful gatefold image, with a painting depicting a woman destroying a rope bridge, leaving the authorities stranded while an outdoor illegal rave commences on the other side. And this was all to do with the criminal justice bill that essentially tried to stop raves from happening. I think it would be really great to try to acquire a copy that has that gatefold. Brian Eno, Another Green World. Another Green World is a game-changing and masterful piece of work from one of the greatest musical innovators of the 20th century. For this album, Brian Eno went into the studio with no written material and relied heavily on oblique strategies cards to guide the creative process. The cards were designed by Eno and artist Peter Schmidt to spur creative ideas and clear writer's block. They would have very simple suggestions written on them, which would determine which direction you went in. When constructing a song in the studio, Eno's mentality was incredibly spontaneous and open. He relied upon improvisations from the musicians to determine which direction the musical composition would take. One of the downsides to working in that way is that there's far less guarantee of a successful outcome than working in a more typical calculated fashion, by means of actually developing ideas before you enter the studio over a long period of time. And for the first 4 or 5 days working on the album, nothing really came of it. Another Green World, alongside most of Eno's catalogue, serves as a perfect soundtrack to the more beautiful aspects of nature and humanity, which is probably why his music's been featured so heavily in documentaries and movies over the years. Listening to Another Green World gives more of a feeling of exploring a modern art gallery than listening to an album. He creates tranquil passages and blissful moments of delicate sound art, as opposed to conventional songs with lyrics. Much of Another Green World is quite musically ambiguous, both tonally and stylistically. It's music where you can't quite figure out whether it's trying to be mournful or optimistic, or whether it's classical or ambient. I always feel a great deal of comfort listening to tracks like Sky Soar, St. Elmo's Fire, and the title track. It really does create its own tranquil world that you can escape to, and it's just about as well-rounded and cohesive as an album can be. Even the artwork really puts you in the world in which this album creates. You have this avant-garde minimalist artwork that's not particularly detailed, but what is implied is so intriguing that it keeps you endlessly fascinated, which I think perfectly mirrors the musical content. Interestingly, this is actually a really small detail from a much larger painting called After FIL by Tom Phillips. DJ Shadow, Endtroducing. Whenever I produce a piece of music, somehow I always end up incorporating elements of 1990s downtempo and trip-hop music. And Endtroducing is always a big reference point whenever I'm doing that style of production. History has it that this is the first album to be made almost entirely out of samples, and it's one of the best examples of an album that's comprised of different sounds, sampled from completely unrelated sources, merging together so perfectly as if they were always supposed to go together. This album really lives in a world of its own. I would describe it as being very summery and tranquil, but also highly cinematic and spacey. There's a wonderful sort of 35mm film quality about the whole thing. The world of sampling old records endlessly fascinates me like nothing else. And when you begin to pull apart a record like Endtroducing, you go on a journey looking at where all these sounds originally came from, and you discover some really great, lesser known music that would have otherwise been widely unknown or forgotten. The number song samples audio from 18 different tracks, and it's a showcase of drum solos, vocal snippets, and hip hop flavoured ad-libs, with a soaring bass line sampled from a Metallica song. Stem Long Stem is a highly influential track for me, as it really takes you on a journey and shows you through multiple different sections. Whilst it has strong elements of hip hop, really it feels more like a film score. When getting myself a physical copy of this record, I had to go the extra mile and get the limited blue version, and this is supposed to be one of the better sounding pressings that you can get of this album. Gorillaz self-titled. Whilst I do think that Demon Days and Plastic Beach are the best records put out by the band, there's something about the cartoony aesthetic of the first album that just appeals to me the most. Considering that it sold 7 million copies, this record is so gritty and lo-fi and downright wacky in parts. Gorillaz first came about when Damon Albarn and artist Jamie Hewlett were watching MTV and became disheartened with how manufactured and downright awful a lot of the content on there was. So the idea to manufacture a virtual band arose. This nicely fitted in with Damon's desire to branch out from Blur and try new things. He was hugely inspired by Massive Attack with this album and incorporated elements of hip-hop, dub, reggae and rock into the music. The music was written at Studio 13, and Jamie and Damon would often pop into each other's studios in the early days of the project, hoping that the concepts and characters thought up by Jamie would inspire the music and vice versa. Damon and company had constructed about 75% of the album when they felt it was necessary to bring on board a more established producer with a background in hip-hop to finish the record. They employed Dan the Automator, who enhanced the tracks, as well as incorporated his own original musical elements, such as sampled drum loops and sound effects. A song that originated from Dan being present in the studio was Rock the House, which is mostly built around a John Dankworth sample, which consisted of drums and an unforgettable trumpet loop. Damon plays the flute and a fun piano line over the top of it. It was also Dan that brought a lot of the collaborators onto the project, such as Del the Funky Homo Sapien and Tina Weymouth, as well as bassist Junior Dan and turntablist Kid Koala. One of the group's biggest songs, Clint Eastwood, was actually written on an omnichord, which is effectively electronic auto harp from the 1980s, which was originally designed as a learning instrument for children. You can find the original preset that he used and find that a lot of the essence of the song comes from that. An interesting fact is that Damon plays a great deal of melodica on the song and on the album as a whole, and that, as well as the omnichord, was kind of designed as a really easy instrument for children to learn on. The bit-crushed sounding percussion that runs throughout the song was created by shaking a carrier bag full of nuts and bolts, and the synth strings came from one of the many beat-up, ramshackle vintage instruments at Studio 13. There's something really dark and Halloween-themed about Phase 1 Gorillaz, maybe due to Jamie's fascination with Dawn of the Dead and The Exorcist. This theme is particularly prevalent on the G-Sides compilation, which is essentially the unused material from the album. You've got really spooky tracks like Hip Albatross, Left Hand Suzuki Method, Ghost Train, and perhaps most of all Dracula, which is one of my all-time favourite Gorillaz tracks. It's a fantastic dub-inspired song with cartoony dialogue samples and a prominent saxophone. Tomorrow Comes the Day was originally a demo for the Blur 13 sessions, and they didn't have much of a budget for a video as it was the first single from the group, so all the cartoons are 2D with real-life photography for the backdrops. I was lucky enough to grab myself a copy of the Tomorrow Comes Today EP, which is the first thing the group ever released. This also contains the English version of the track Latin Simone, which I like just as much as the Spanish version, which was featured on the album with Abraham Ferrer. I think this is my current favourite song from this period of the group. There's something very hopeless and apocalyptic about the song, and I think that it's probably the most Demon Days sounding track on the album.